You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. And coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And I've got to tell you right at the beginning of this show that the opinions expressed here are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. And thank you so much for joining me. It's another beautiful Wednesday day here in the heart of the inland Northwest. And today I wanted to talk about responsibility, personal and collective responsibility, or rather the lack of it. You know, it seems to me that, like the Leonard Cohen song, everybody knows the boat is leaking. Everybody knows the captain lied. Everybody got this sinking feeling like their father or their dog just died. It seems to sum it up pretty well. We face really great issues, but no one's doing anything about them. We have serious problems confronting us, and we seem unable, both individually and collectively as a people, to get anything to happen, to get anything to change, to organize what would be a transformative or revolutionary movement. I used the R word. Uh-oh. Well, that's okay. Chris Hedges used it, and he's going to be here soon. Anyway, being Spokane, that is. We face these great issues. You know, what are we looking at here? We have eternal wars run by an empire that is being driven insane. We have wars by ideologues for whom adherence to unproven assertions and beliefs that can't be demonstrated are somehow the highest good. We find things like the worship of power, the worship of the state, the worship of wealth, the worship of destruction as national priorities, as national icons that we should look up to. And I'm thinking specifically of you, neoconservatives, when I say these things, because if there is a political ideology that sums that up beautifully, that encompasses all of these elements, it's neoconservatism, which is focused pretty much entirely on the maintenance of the state, and the maintenance of the state as an entity that is divorced from the people. It manages them. It's not terribly interested in their input. It really has no place in its philosophy for their input. And we've got a lot of these who are still around from the Bush and Cheney days when they flooded into D.C. And wormed their way into a lot of the apparatus of the U.S. state, in the Secretary of State's office, in the military, in the intelligence communities, other places as well. There are a lot of these people, and they drive these notions of empire and notions of nationalism as a religion. But the rest of us who see all of this, as I was saying last week, it is virtually impossible for us to look at all the stuff going on in the world, to look at the news, to make sense of it, and actually see anything cogent that we could do to change it. And we're not really trained to do that anyway. We're trained to be passive consumers. We're trained to sit there and watch whatever our minders want to put on the television, or whatever the people who are fishing for clickbait decide to put on the internet, on Facebook or some such thing. And it's extremely hard for us to find a way out of this collective fantasy that we seem to be mired in. A collective fantasy that's marked by distraction, that's marked by hyperstimulation, lots of flashy lights, bangy noises, things blowing up. It's marked by fear. It's marked by envy. It's marked by materialism. We face some really great issues, but we refuse, we're unable, we're paralyzed to actually get up and do anything about them. This is a major issue. We can't do it individually, and we have trouble organizing ourselves collectively for a lot of reasons. It may be, as John Dewey said, it's not that we have no public, it's that we have too many publics. They're all fragmented. They're little pieces here and there, and they don't have shared signs and shared symbols that would bring them together where they could actually have conversations about moving forward. That could be part of it. Part of it, however, is also that we have a lot of damage to our minds, to our psyches, to our collective understandings of who we are as a people in this country. We seem unable to address wrongs we've done in the past and seek in that some sort of peace, some kind of forgiveness. And because we can't address the past, we run from it, we hide from it, and at every opportunity, it ambushes us. There was a rather good piece on a site called The Four Media by Dmitry Menon called America, the Hypocrisy Empire. And he asked a couple of interesting questions. He says, what is the main specific feature of the American empire to distinguish it from other empires in history? And he refers to the unparalleled hypocrisy penetrating life in America. And goes on to note that American politicians and state leaders do not realize the extent of the double standards practiced in the United States, based on the old principle of quod licet Jovi non licet bovi. Gods may do what cattle may not. So what one group can do, another group cannot do. And this has a long, long resonance in American history. It's a deep part of who we are, that we live, as Menon writes, in a double mindset. We live between two parallel worlds, or simultaneously in both of them. On the one hand, there's this modern state structure, right, the shining city on a hill, and on the other hand is this egregious history of genocide and slavery, and particularly slavery. We've never really come to grips with slavery. Do we have a race problem in this country? Yes, we do. Why? Because we've never come to grips with slavery. We have a mindset that we shared with our forefathers. We share with our forefathers that we can be modern thinkers, forward lookers, we can have lofty ideals, and then simultaneously think like a slave owner who treats people as if they were cattle. Menon goes on to quote Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Generally speaking, it requires great and constant efforts for men to create lasting ills. But there is one evil which has percolated furtively into the world. At first it was hardly noticed among the usual abuses of power. It began with an individual whose name history does not record. It was cast like an accursed seed somewhere on the ground. It then nurtured itself, grew without effort, and spread with the society that accepted it. That evil was slavery." De Tocqueville continued, "The moderns, then, after they have abolished slavery, have three prejudices to contend against, which are less easy to attack and far less easy. I'll read that again. three main prejudices to contend with, which are less easy to attack and far less easy to conquer than the mere fact of servitude. The prejudice of the master, the prejudice of the race, and the prejudice of color. And these are our three demons that haunt the national psyche. The prejudice of the master, the prejudice of the race, and the prejudice of color. Slavery, Menon notes, gives rise to a double conscience, and it influenced the internal evolution of the U.S. people. And of course now we've turned it outward so that we treat the rest of the world as if they are our servants and we are the masters. We still have this master-slave mentality from which we cannot free ourselves. We still have a prejudice of the race, especially in the form of nation. As I've remarked on the show before, our word nation derives from the word for race. And we certainly have a prejudice of color. Menon continues, that's why they behave like masters. He means Americans. That's why they behave like masters towards other people. The sounds of whip used by the slave owner is heard behind them. And practice double standards in international relations. The history provides plenty of such examples. Slavery is the main driving force behind the gradual progress of turning the United States into a total empire of hypocrisy with no historical analogs. There really is nothing to compare. And this really is our stumbling block. Until we can view our history of slavery as what it was and see the lines that continue into the culture today, we cannot come together. The prejudice of the master, the prejudice of the race, and the prejudice of color. We're obsessed with power in this country. We're obsessed with color in this country, the colors of people, and we're obsessed with race, nation. Truly we are. So we have all of these problems: wars, poverty, climate change, a loss of morality at all levels of the state, a loss of morality, of ethics on all levels of society, a loss of morality and ethics in our own lives. If bankers can steal, why is stealing not okay? If governments can lie with impunity, why is it not okay? How do we tell children not to lie when they're surrounded by lies? How do we do it? How do we establish our own moral and ethical compass in a world that is, in a country that is deeply schizoid and on many levels extremely unjust? I mean, there are lots of people who claim that they're doing this. They know what the bit on morality is, and they'll share it with us, usually for a fee. But largely, there are those people who always see the speck in somebody else's eye and never see the board in their own. These are the people who can tell everybody else what they're doing wrong. You're evil, you're corrupt, you're depraved, but I've got the lock on ethics. I can tell you how to do it. And sometimes this takes the form of overt religion, like Pat Robertson, who's always a lot of fun. The latest insight from this pundit, Pat Robertson, that I saw involved his concern, he had a lady on the phone who was concerned that her daughter was posting ultrasounds of her fetus on Facebook. And Pat Robertson explained, yes, indeed, there are covens of witches in the world who could use that picture to put a curse or inflict demons on your unborn child. I mean, that would have been crazy in the 12th century to say this kind of stuff. But now, he can say it. Talk about witches. Yeah, boy. Raising the dead, whatever. We have people like that Guy and Duck Dynasty or the Duggars or Westboro Baptist Church. Some of these people may sincerely believe what they believe, but at the end of the day, I don't really care what they believe, what they espouse. For all I see is that it is without love. It does, however, make them money. Religion is one of the easiest cons to run. There's a long history of people running the religion con on folks. Not all people of faith, certainly not, are con artists. Not all people of faith certainly are being conned. But it's an easy con to run on people who want a quick fix, who want an easy way out. And the damage of this con game, is greatest to those of real faith and genuine love than to those who get fleeced sending in the money. People who get fleeced sending in the money, well, a fool and his money are soon parted, as the saying goes, but I think it does real damage to people who find their own beliefs distorted, mocked, derided, because these, what shall we call them, charlatans? These charlatans, these half-baked, what shall I call them? These half-baked ministers of the divine run around and say all kinds of outlandish things and usually get a nice bit of coin on it. So this is one kind of fleecing that's undertaken. But there are other, what shall I call them, gods that we worship, other areas of our world where we see these same kinds of fleecings going on. We see them in, well, there's the great fleecing of national security. How national security must be maintained because there are all these threats. There are people with bombs in their underwear. And these are not generally significant threats. They're generally not existential threats. You are much more likely to fall in the bathtub and kill yourself than you are to be killed by a terrorist. But we don't fear falling in the bathtub, well, unless you're my mother. But we do fear terrorists. And we worship the security apparatus that's grown up, and it demands that we worry. It demands that we give it money. It demands that we surrender rights to it. It's very much like the military in this way. The military is going to make us safe. It's going to help out other people. Dropping bombs on people is generally not considered helpful. Destroying democratically elected governments by force is generally not considered helpful by most folks. I know I would take a dim view of it if somebody did that to me, but we worship it. It is the sacrosanct thing. It is that which cannot be criticized. It is that to which we must pay money, to which we must sacrifice our wealth, our children, our good name, our decency, and finally our souls, I think, to the security state. And then we've got the people who, we see the corruption of the people in charge of the security state. And I don't mean common corruption like they're stealing money. Some of them probably do. Or get kickbacks, and these kinds of things happen, but they often get caught and the people get punished because that's okay. It makes it look like the system's working. I'm talking about the people who organize and command and operate the security state apparatus and how they are corrupted in their thought to think that they have rights and powers and a special understanding of the world that the rest of us just don't have, that entitles them to shred the Constitution, to engage in undeclared wars, to murder people around the globe, whatever. There was an interesting piece on The Atlantic by Connor Friedersdorf quite recently called Michael Hayden's Hollow Constitution. Now, Michael Hayden is the former head of both the CIA and the NSA. And he was arguing in his talk, he was saying in his talk, that unreasonable search and seizure, of course, is prohibited by the Constitution. But there's this reasonableness clause, right, that you have to have a reason to search and seize. And this changes under circumstances, and he gets to decide what the circumstances are. So he's talking about after September 11. I'm quoting Hayden now. I actually started to do different things, and I didn't need to ask Mother May I from Congress or the President or anyone else. It was within my charter, and an aside here, we can't even read the charter of the NSA. It is classified. But he says it's in his charter. But in terms of the mature judgment about what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, the death of 3,000 countrymen kind of took me in a direction over here, perfectly within my authority, but a different place than the one in which I was located before the attacks took place. So if we're going to draw a line, I think we have to understand that it's kind of a movable feast here. And Friedersdorf writes, I think I understand. The Bill of Rights may guarantee certain limits on government today, but if there's a terrorist attack tomorrow, a bureaucrat within the national security state may decide, without asking permission from any elected official, that the people are actually owed less protections than before. The more innocent people that terrorists succeed in murdering, the less our government is limited by the Constitution. With every attack that the government fails to prevent, it gains new powers. Hayden says, privacy is the line we continuously negotiate between ourselves as unique creatures of God and ourselves as social animals. In the first category, we have a right to keep things to ourselves. And in the second category, we have a responsibility to reveal things about ourselves to the community for the greater good. And Friedersdorf asks, what goes in which category? Hayden's actions suggest that Americans have a responsibility to reveal all the telephone numbers that we dial and that dial us, aspects of our web activity, and James Clapper only knows what else for the greater good. And that government officials have a right to give themselves sweeping changes in how surveillance affects Americans, rendering the electorate too ignorant to protest via elected representatives. So here you go. Michael Hayden saying he can decide how far the Constitution goes in things like privacy. And I guess he can decide, too, that we don't need things like habeas corpus. And we don't need jury trials. And we've already seen that pulled by these same types of officials. So these gods of power who take on the avatars of politics or of management, again, they promise salvation, but all they ever deliver is disillusionment and apathy. And this is where we find ourselves, disillusioned and apathetic. We can't change anything. We're denied the levers of government. We can't understand anything. Nobody's doing a good job of explaining it to us. And meanwhile, we're distracted and caught within a consumerist world, which encourages us not to be active in creating our world and our reality, but simply to watch it on TV or buy it at one of the box stores. Right? Look at the problem of climate change. Think about climate change. We're in denial. we're in denial about climate change. We refuse to take responsibility. We refuse to take action individually and collectively. Okay, some people may ride the bus more. And that's a good thing. But there are a lot of things have to change. But here's the problem. As Joel Hirschhorn pointed out in a recent article, he was reviewing a book by David Ray Griffin called Unprecedented. And the book, Unprecedented, talks about, in nice, calm, reasonable statements, how drastic the situation is, how compelling is the overwhelming scientific evidence that's in front of us. There was a recent proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, for instance, that said 316 U.S. cities are facing tragedy. Big chunks of them will cease to be above water. We're talking 3.6 million people here in cities like San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Charleston, Galveston. And without action, without forceful action, things are just going to get worse. So Hirschhorn's wondering, does this severe warning, does this yet another call for people to see how serious the situation, how dire the situation in which we find ourselves is, will only make them more apathetic. Right? Griffin says at the end of his book, quote, "Given our refusal to cut emissions over the past 30 years, it is already too late to save the kind of world that has been hospitable to human beings since the rise of civilization." Hirschhorn points out this has some credence. Quote, "But it also can feed broad public disinterest because it is too late and makes it difficult to take gutsy political action and spend big money on remedies." 2013, only 28% of Americans believed that climate change should be a top priority. 2015 poll, Hirschhorn cites, that the one segment of the U.S. population with the strongest views for addressing climate change is Hispanics, and that white Republicans have the least concern. So, are we just going to stay locked in what Hirschhorn calls pessimism, selfishness, and narcissism? Are we going to ignore the future generations? Because this is their world we're destroying. It's the world of our children and our grandchildren. And it's here. It's already here. I mean, you've lived through this winter with the rest of us here in Spokane. And, 50 degrees in February, in the second week of February. It's. I know you can't point to an individual incident, but I see a world where this is our future. And if you extrapolate this to summers, I see a world where we'll be in triple digits for big chunks of summer. And then what's going to happen to all these pretty green forests around here? What's going to happen to all these lakes and streams and water supplies that depend on snowmelt if there's no snow? What's going to happen to the cities that depend on the Colorado River if there's no snowmelt or insufficient snowmelt to supply them with water? These are problems that are at our door. They're knocking. And we're not addressing them. So is it because we're apathetic? Is it because we don't think we can do anything? I'm not so sure. I think a big part of our problem is more fundamental than that. And that is that we live in a falsehood. We live in a myth that continues to damage people. It especially damages relationships between people. It damages the world, and it destroys all the values except for economic ones. The French theorist Jean-Pierre Dupuy, back in the 80s, wrote an interesting little piece called Myths of the Informational Society. And he begins it with this statement: "My theme will be that the more we communicate the way we do, the more we create a hellish world. I take hell in its theological sense, that is, a place which is void of grace, the undeserved, unnecessary, surprising, unforeseen. A paradox is at work here. Ours is a world in which we pretend to have more and more information, but which seems to us increasingly devoid of meaning." I would argue that this is due to the inevitable, ironical, counterproductive way in which we produce, process, and consume information. Now, this is an interesting idea. If you think about how everything in our culture is structured around economics, everything. So, what do we make in a post-industrial society? What does economics want us to manufacture? Well, we've outsourced all of our material production, or big chunks of it, to places that can't really protect themselves from the ravages of the factories, China, the maquiladoras in Mexico, other places. But, we've got all this other stuff we can manufacture, like culture, health, education, travel, security, leisure, better relationships with others. And all these things that used to be largely done in relationships, we now hire experts for. If your kid's acting strangely, do you call a psychiatrist, or do you call your Aunt Debbie, who's raised, her share of kids? We're forced more and more into this world of mediated commerce, the informational society, where everything that is worth anything can be commodified. Your time, your desire, your thoughts, your vote, what you watch, everything can be commodified, and things that can't be commodified have no purpose. They told us that the information networks and mass communications would bring people together. And this has been said of every new innovation in communication technology in history, going back to the origins of writing, and then print, and then the telegraph, and then the telephone, and then radio, and then television, and now the internet, that somehow we've entered this new age, this golden age, that will bring people together in peace and understanding, because we'll all be able to talk to each other, and everything will just go swimmingly. But we never shed that economic overcoat that brings with it, as Dupuy notes, competition, envy, the pursuit of selfish interests, individualism, all of these things. It doesn't bring those. And in fact, because our consumption is so inextricably tied to what we produce, we're always involved in the process, even when we think we're relaxing, even when we think we're kicking back, we're going to watch the game, we're going to do a little web surfing, whatever, play a little WOW online. We're always buying, we're always selling, we're always participating in a situation that is structured by the commodity that we're consuming and calling communication. And it used to be in classical economics, you could distinguish between things that had a value of what you could do with them, their use value, and commodity values. So commodity values just had prices that were based on whether it was scarce or not, by and large, whereas use was, what can you do with the darn thing? But now all we have are commodity values. And if you can't monetize these, if you can't put a dollar sign on them, they're of no use. So if you think, Jane Jacobs, back in the day, wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And one of the things she points out in there is that all those people who are sitting on their stoop, all those people who are just sitting in their apartments looking out the windows, all those people who are just strolling around the neighborhood or going down to the bodega, have a value. Those crowds on the street have a value. Because it's these non-productive eyes that guarantee that it's not a desert. And the residential neighborhoods aren't death traps, as Dupuy calls them. Giving eyes to the street. This is productive. This improves safety, liveliness, conviviality. It makes the city live. And there are benefits of this. But we can't commodify it. And so we tend to devalue it. It's something that we'll hire cops to do. We'll put up CCTVs. All of these can be commodified. They figure into GDP. People are walking around, making the street a living street, making a neighborhood a living neighborhood, and a city, giving it the vitality and the life of the people who inhabit it, has no value. We can't monetize it. That's where we are. So these values, this consumption of information, is what's valued. But really all we seem to make, the only things we really make with our current forms of production are waste. We have lots and lots of waste. We waste raw materials, we waste energy, we waste human space, we waste time. We waste by building products that are meant to break and be thrown away. We waste because the car makers make new cars that we have to have because they're new. We don't want to look like we have an old car. We waste because we have to watch the shows, the new shows. So the old shows go, we have the new show. It's another form of waste. And we, trapped in this series of falsehoods, this deranged idea that somehow everything that is worthwhile must be commodifiable. Because we adhere to that, we lose the sense of the convivial, the social. Convivial, literally living among, living with others. But economics governs every aspect of our world. Every aspect of the planet, every major action that governments and institutions undertake. Our leaders talk about production, but mostly we make waste. Our economy is 70% consumption, and consumerism itself necessitates inefficiency, waste, destruction. Make more, consume more. Got to keep the GDP up. Remember what George Bush told the nation after 9/11? Let's get back to normal. Go shopping. Go to the malls. Really? Because it was all economics. Here's the point. These falsehoods about which I'm speaking are so pervasive that they structure the whole of our social world, our personal lives, our politics. The idea of personal life now is a falsehood. But in a sense, it always was. There's no separating the self from the social. What we've done is to replace the social with this mediated form of consumption, consuming news, consuming games, consuming emails, consuming. And that's the world we relate to, not the world of people. And so we create selves out of this interaction, which are not the selves that one creates by interacting with other people. But what are we supposed to interact with? How are we supposed to get out of this myth, this structure that keeps driving us harder and harder and more into a shared national delusion? What is our way out of this? Well, lots of people have tried lots of different things. But if we think about our first problem is understanding the situation we're in. And a number of writers have described our contemporary situation as a spectacle. Chris Hedges has written about it. Guy Debord wrote about it. Lots of people have written about our world as a spectacle. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Guy Debord, at the beginning of his book, The Society of the Spectacle, back in 1967, began the book with a quote from Feuerbach, the German philosopher. And it's part of the preface to his second edition of The Essence of Christianity. And Feuerbach wrote, "But certainly for the present age, which prefers the sign to the thing signified, the copy to the original, representation to reality, the appearance to the essence, illusion only is sacred, truth profane. Nay, sacredness is held to be enhanced in proportion as truth decreases and illusion increases, so that the highest degree of illusion comes to be the highest degree of sacredness." Well, that's just the Wizard of Oz, isn't it? And it is rather descriptive of our world and how we live in it. It's remarkably descriptive of this. Debord noted that all of life in modern society presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was lived directly has moved away into a representation. Everything that was lived directly has moved away into a representation. The images detached from every aspect of life fuse in a common stream in which the unity of this life can no longer be reestablished. The connection we don't have to people. I see so many young people, especially young men, who have no clue how to be with people. They're like a dog that you raise in a box. It doesn't understand how to interact, and if it doesn't learn by a certain age, it never really gets very good at it. I see these people who can't talk. I see people who can't recognize that other people are people. And sometimes that's because they're the wrong race. And sometimes that's because they're the wrong class. And sometimes that's because they're from the wrong nation. And I can't recognize them as people then because they're not like me. But often as not, they simply never learned how to do it. They simply never learned how to recognize people, except for their tiny little group. And everything that doesn't fit that is somehow only a representation. But it's always a representation that's bound up with these values of war, of defense, of hatred, of economics. It's always bound up there. We could throw in sexualization, the sexualization of children. There's a lovely video going around on Facebook right now and YouTubes and such places of this woman in New Zealand who started taking Bratz dolls that she found in rubbish bins and secondhand stores and changing their faces to make them look like human beings instead of young prostitutes, making them look human. And she was just doing it as something to do because she thought it was a good idea and she could give the dolls to her kids. And, so she posted some stuff online. And now she's getting 120,000 people contacting her, saying, where can we get these dolls? Where can we get dolls that actually look like people? Where can I go on TV to find people who actually look like people? Who act like people? Who talk like people? You see the problem. The spectacle is not, as De Boer noted, the spectacle is not a collection of images. It is a social relation among people, mediated by images. We use the media, this mediation as a template, as the touchstone. What should people look like? How should things be? How should people act? And when reality falls short, well, it's a lot easier to prefer the media. It's a lot easier to prefer the spectacle, which is always there. Everybody's pretty. Everybody's witty. Everybody's charming. And we consume. Or we tune into the news, and here are the grave threats against us which we must fear, and these are the reasons we must give our government the Constitution to do with as it pleases, because it alone will protect us. Now, what would protect us would be seeing the world as people, seeing these folks we call enemies and terrorists and Muslims in a bad way as people. But we can't get past this mediation. We can't get past the image, the word, the sounds that have been drummed and drummed and drummed. So we keep swashing around through this enormous quagmire of social deception, self-deception. And we go out and we worship all these false gods of security and economics and money like it's all going to make sense. Like it's all going to pay off for it. It's really going to happen. And I don't think even most people believe that anymore, if they ever did. But I don't know that people have any other idea of what to think. How else would they live if they didn't live like this? How would they know their value if it wasn't in the consumption of stuff manufactured in China that they can wear, display, play, drive in, fly through the air? How would they know? How would they know? You know, in a sense, it's really not surprising that we cannot solve our great problems. We can't even really come up with a critical, coherent statement about them, about what we would do to fix them. I mean, think, how long would a politician last? How long would a politician last who argued the need to reduce the power of capitalism and the reach of the military? How long? They would be drummed out by the cries of Marxist or how he wants to weaken America so our enemies can win. They'd say stuff like that, and it would be from the left and from the right. It would come from both sides. if a politician said wealth needed to be shared. Well, Elizabeth Warren's kind of going there, and Barney Franks, and a handful of other brave people. But it doesn't have that critical mass that would really threaten the structure or really look like something we as people could get on board with. A politician who was running for president argued that the military war machine should be reined in or dismantled. Can you imagine what you would hear? Or if they said, like Grover Norquist said of government, that they wanted to take the military-industrial complex and shrink it to the size that it could be drowned in a bathtub. Can you imagine this actually occurring? Can you imagine what the outcome would be? But we do have real existential threats, no question, that present a clear and present danger to our country, to the world, an imminent existential threat. A couple of them. One is climate change, and one is nuclear war. And these are two events created by people that we should be able to fix, but we can't get it together to fix either one. And it is revealing that both of these continue to exist largely based on lies. And the missile gap, the nuclear war machine, initiated in lies. You go back to the Kennedy administration and think of, they were talking about the missile gap. Well, there was a missile gap. The U.S. had about 10 times more missiles than the Russians did, but that's not what they told the American people. And so they had to talk about deterring the Russians, who were these absolutely evil, voracious, imperial people who wanted to conquer the world, which was a nonsense. It was a pretty good description of what we were doing at the time and continue. But it really wasn't what the Russians were up to at all. They were pretty happy to hunker down and just deal with the Soviet Union by and large. And if we look at the climate change, why can't we address it? What's the thing that's stopping us? Economics and lies. Climate scientists are lying. We hear that on Fox News. There's no real crisis. But the real issue is that oil and energy run the show. Economics, again. And we can't get it together because we're not even talking about the right problem. There was one other interesting piece I stumbled over today that speaks to this issue. It's by M.G. Piety, P-I-E-T-Y. It was on Counterpunch, called When Courage Fails. And she was talking about the problem of why Germans in the beginning of the Nazi period couldn't even acknowledge others on the street with words about what they were seeing in front of them. That they were seeing windows broken and people disappearing and places being burned down. And they couldn't even speak it. They would go to speak and then just say, do you know what time it is? Why couldn't they acknowledge their collective view? And of course, after the war, the Germans had this collective guilt. I didn't know. I couldn't do anything. And then Piety goes on to talk about a nature program she saw about one of those little shows on Discovery Channel or something, about a little wolf cub who wanders out from the other cubs and goes off and comes back, but he's injured his paw. And then the next day, the little cub goes off again, but he doesn't come back. And the other little cubs there in the pack, the two remaining ones, peeked out, trembling, bodies pressed together. And it was another full day before they could even come out of their little shelter. And Piety writes, "And suddenly I understood why human beings are such a miserable, craven lot. Natural selection has ensured that cowardly individuals have a higher survival rate than courageous ones. They live longer, produce more offspring. So it isn't our fault, really, that we're such a miserable, craven lot. It's in our genes. And yet, it is our fault, because cowardice isn't the only thing in our genes. We have somehow also evolved a conscience. We know, as Aristotle expressed it in the Nicomachean Ethics, that there are things we ought rather to face death than do. And yet few of us have the courage to face death, to do the right thing. Few of us have the courage even to say brother to another who affirms the values we purport to hold dear. She concluded her piece with the statement, "We are all guilty of the cravenness that paved the way for the Holocaust. The glass through which we keep seeing darkly, which we keep turning over and over in a vain attempt to escape from our own reflection. If we had the courage to recognize ourselves in it, then perhaps we could learn from it. But courage, sadly, is precisely what we lack." It is partly that. Real courage is what we lack. But as we live in these equilibriums of terror, these fragile and unsustainable lurches between crises, can we not find a language and find the courage to take back the commonality of life, all people? Can we not individually and collectively take responsibility for our actions and for our inactions? Dupuy concluded his piece with a line that has always stuck with me, if I can find it. He argued that he wrote that it was our main wealth is in our humanity. Our main wealth is in our humanity and our power to marvel, our capacity to surprise, to do the thing that no one thinks we can do, to do the thing that we're being constantly led away from doing. This power to marvel, to surprise, to take back the communality of life, of all people, all life. Now that would be something new, if we have the courage to bring it about. And that concludes today's version of Long Waves. Thank you for joining me here. You've been listening to Gary Krug on Long Waves. And you can reach me at longwaves at kyrs.org. You can find me on Facebook. Look for Long Waves Radio. And there are also links to the podcasts of this show and the old podcasts there as well. So, again, thank you for joining, and I'll remind you, you've been listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3. Until next week, take care, stay smart,